Hi there, this is Kirk with Winning Variant. Today we're going to walk through an experimentation example using the Winning Variant Snowflake native app. Winning Variant is currently the only experimentation platform available 100% as a Snowflake native app, meaning that everything runs completely inside your Snowflake environment. There's no complex data ingestion pipelines to create, and there's no exfiltration of data of any kind, even for analysis. And we'll show how that works here as part of this demo. The example we're going to walk through today is a pretty common e-commerce type of experiment where we have a checkout flow and we want to test adding the ability to pay with Apple Pay at the end of the checkout experience. So our experiment's going to have two variants. The first is the control, which is our existing experience without Apple Pay. The second is our treatment, which is going to include the Apple Pay option. And our hypothesis here is that conversion rates will increase due to the Apple Pay option and that time to purchase will decrease because we're hoping this will actually allow customers to check out faster. We're also going to monitor a few secondary metrics such as total revenue and transaction volume. So the nice thing about Winning Variant operating as a native app is that we have the ability to manage our experiments directly inside of Snowflake as well. This means that we can use Snowflake's existing RBAC without having to provision new user accounts in some other third-party cloud in order for teams to create and configure and manage experiments over time. In this example, we're going to use the built-in stored procedures to create Winning Variant assets. The first thing we're going to do is create what we call a lab. A lab is essentially just a workspace that will end up containing a number of experiments. So this could be assigned to an individual, there could be labs per team, or it doesn't really matter. We're going to create a lab that we're calling samples here, and we do this simply by YAML that defines this experimentation asset and applying it via the stored procedure that's built into the native app. And you'll see once we do this that we create the sample lab. So that's all set up. The next thing we need to do is define what we call a subject type. So a subject type is an identifier type that can go into an experiment. You can also think about it as the type of identifier that an experiment might be randomized on. So common examples here are a known customer ID, an anonymous ID. If you're dealing with maybe testing, let's say, a Cortex agent inside of a chat session, the identifier here might be the session ID. What's important, though, is that we choose something that's going to be consistent throughout this experiment, because it's very important that the same person, session, etc. ends up being pinned to the same variant throughout the life of the experiment to avoid data contamination later in our analysis. So in our hypothetical Apple Pay checkout experiment, we're going to use anonymous ID because we're assuming that when someone adds a product to their cart and they enter the experiment, that they're not yet signed in. We don't necessarily know who they are. So we're going to use some anonymous ID that's presumably stored in a cookie in the user's browser. So same process here. We create the YAML that defines this asset. We're saying it's a subject type. We're giving it an identifier of anonymous ID. And then we can give it a type here that's used for matching later. So in this case, our anonymous ID is a UUID. And this is customizable. We could enter our own regular expression depending on the identifier type if it's not one of the built-in supported ones. Same thing here, then we can see that our asset's been created. The next step is to go ahead and create the experiment. So we're going to do the exact same thing. Create the YAML for the experimentation config. And a few things to point out here. So we're going to give it same thing, identifier, Apple Pay. We're going to tell it to live inside of the samples lab that we created above. We say that the subject type is that anonymous ID subject type that we created above. We're going to define our two variants. So we're going to define first the control variant and our treatment variant. And then we're going to launch this with a single cohort, and we're going to actually use each of those variants in the cohort. So here we have cohort 1, and we want control to see, we want 95% of traffic to see control, and we want 5% of traffic to see treatment. So this is effectively acting as our ramp-up period. We want to launch this Apple Pay experiment with low volume just to make sure it's not breaking anything for anyone. And then assuming it doesn't, we'll ramp it up into the full experiment later. So when we run this, it'll go ahead and create the experiment and make it available right away because we, in this example, we set the status to active. In practice, we probably would create this experiment in draft status so that we can have it fully configured, and then when we're ready to roll it out to production, we would change the status to active, which would then enable it, and we'd be able to then start generating assignments for that experiment. So let's assume this is run for a few days. The Apple Pay experience is being served to 5% of traffic, and it's not breaking anything. Great. So now what we want to do is ramp up to a true 50-50. This is really simple. We need to just add another cohort and specify a new split for those variants. So we're going to submit the same YAML configuration that we had before, except we're going to add another cohort. And we're going to say control is 50%, treatment is 50%. And winning variant keeps track of this additional cohort. And when assignments are made, a particular assignment is pinned to the active cohort at the time of assignment. When we do this, we can see, okay, winning variant recognized this as a resource update, and we have a resource version of 2. So internally, the native app will keep track of asset versions, and that's true for experiments, subject types, and labs. This way, it's really easy to pin changes to an asset directly back to a resource version. And this is particularly helpful in scenarios like having to do a rollback later on if we need to. All right, so at this point, our experiment is live. We have 2 cohorts. It's been ramped up to 50-50. Let's take a look at what some of the dimension tables are going to look like in the app. So as we create these are immediately available. There's different application roles that are defined inside of the native app that allow Snowflake administrators to assign their own roles to those application roles to allow access to different features of the app. We have in particular what we call an analyst view, and so that's our analyst role, and that's one of the roles that allows access to the dimension tables. So inside of the app, we have this experimentation schema. We have an experiments table inside of there. And so if we filter on the Apple Pay experiment that we just created above, we can see here a lot of the same data that we entered. We can see the active resource version, the status, the subject type associated with it, and we can see the active cohort is 2, right? So this again tells us if we're doing analysis later, we can use this potentially to join on assignment data if we only want to pull data from the most current cohort. We also have an experiment variance table exposed from the native app, and then, so for each experiment, we can see what are the variants that are defined. Now, this doesn't necessarily tell us the percentages or even if one of these was active in the most recent cohort, but it does tell us all the variants that were ever used as part of this experiment. Separately, we have an experiment cohorts table that allows us to break down for each cohort what was the split between the different variants. So here we can see our cohort 1, we had the 95.5% split. Cohort 2, we were 50-50, and then we can see the times that those were created. So if we ever need to see what time that cohort began, we can use this timestamp here. And now that all this stuff is configured, I just want to switch over real quick and show the winning variant interface. So this also is running 100% inside of your Snowflake account. There's a separate URL that you'll be able to access this, and access to this is managed through Snowflake RBAC. So we have, again, different application roles that you can map your own internal roles to that will give users access to this interface. We can see here we have the sample lab that we created. Inside of that, we have our Apple Pay and checkout experiment that we created. At any point, we can actually view the YAML configuration for an asset. So that allows us to see how it was configured. And in this particular case, we can go in and we can take a look at the status of this experiment. We can see the cohort 2 is active, the timestamp of when it was made active, what the variant split looks like. We can look at past cohorts, current hypothesis, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's assume that this experiment's been deployed. We need to start getting experimentation assignments. So there's a number of ways that we can do that from the native app. 2 in particular. One is through a user-defined function. So if the experiment is being managed inside of Snowflake. So let's say, for example, we're doing an experiment inside of a stored procedure, or we're doing some sort of ML or Cortex-based experiment that operates inside of Snowflake. We can use the create assignment UDF exposed through the native app to get or create an assignment for an identifier. Otherwise, we can use the variant API, which is a RESTful API that's exposed from the native app. Essentially, what we're doing when we're creating an assignment is we're saying, hey, here's a subject ID, and here's the experiment. And I want you to give me back a consistent variant for that combination that I can use for this experiment. So in this case, the code would be providing the anonymous ID, it would be providing the Apple Pay experiment ID, and it would be expecting back either control or treatment. Then the engineering team would have that information and be able to serve the appropriate experience. In this case, it would just toggle on or off that Apple Pay option at the end of checkout. Winning Variant then takes care of keeping track of which cohort that assignment was made in, when the assignment was made, and also making sure that it's consistent so that every time you subsequently request an assignment for that subject and experiment pair, that it will always return the same variant. So in our example here, we went ahead and we provided a bunch of sample assignments. Here's just some examples of what that would end up looking like. We have an assignments fact table that's made available through the native app. And in it, we have a unique assignment ID. Subject ID is the identifier that was provided for this experiment. So we know that in this example, the subject ID is our anonymous ID. We have the experiment that subject fell into, and then we have the variant that was assigned to it. We can see the cohort that they entered the experiment at. So these first 20 sample ones that we pulled all entered at cohort 1, and we can see the exact time that this assignment was made. So in our example, we know that this assignment is being made when the user first adds a product to cart. So we also know that this is essentially when their checkout process began, because it was the same timestamp as when they first added that product to cart. Now that we have our sample assignment data, that's effectively what Winning Variant as a native app is going to produce. Let's take a look at what you already have inside of your Snowflake account, and then we can show how powerful it is that they're living next to each other. So as an organization, you already have all of your business metrics. You have other transaction and fact tables available that hold all of the data you might want to compare against an experiment. So in this case, we would be looking at sales because we want to see how does this Apple Pay experience impact revenue, conversion rate, etc. So we have a sample data set here that is a very overly simplified example of what a sales fact table might look like. We have a sales ID, timestamp, our anonymous identifier associated with that checkout session, and then we have their total purchase amount. In reality, you're going to have a lot more information, right? But one way or another, we'd be able to boil it down to something simple like this that gives us the metrics that we need to compare to see how well this experiment is performing. So in this hypothetical example, right, we have a separate database with a separate set of tables that has our business metrics, and this is already living inside of Snowflake. Great. How can we use all of this now, right? We have all the data. Let's put it to use. So the first thing we can do, for example, is take the assignment data that we have from Winning Variant, and we can start to do some really basic cohort summaries. So the first thing we're looking at here is we just want to confirm that each cohort had the appropriate split of traffic. So we're comparing cohort 1 to cohort 2. We can see cohort 1 had the appropriate 5%, 95% split, and cohort 2 was the appropriate 50-50. So this is just helpful in validating that our experiment is correct. We can look at this from a different angle and take a look at bucketed users over time. So let's actually look at those assignments and see over time, where did those assignments go into different variants? So we can see here for, we're looking just at cohort 2 now because we're just going to ignore that ramp up for analysis purposes. And we can see that over time, obviously there's a little bit of fluctuation as you would expect, but it pretty much stays at 50-50 over time. If we do see some anomalies here, right, maybe one spikes up or one spikes down, that will give us an indication that something went wrong in the experiment during that time because we don't have equal representation of all the different variants. In this example, everything's looking great. So what do we do now, right? How do we take the experimentation data and actually use that against our sales data? It's super easy. In this case, because everything's living in Snowflake, right, which is the true power of having everything as a true Snowflake native app, it's all there and available for analysts to join on it immediately. So what we have here is we have a sample query that's giving us an experimentation overview. And what it's doing in particular is it's joining our, some of the dimension tables to our assignments table that's provided as part of the native app and joining that to the sample sales data set that we have to give us the number of assignments per variant, how many total sales occurred per variant, the conversion rate, and then for our treatment group, we can see, in this case, p-value and lift percent. So in this particular sample experiment, our treatment's actually ahead. It has slightly more sales, and we have a 4.55% lift measured for this experiment. So things in this experiment are looking pretty good so far. What about our supplemental metrics, right? Well, we have the ability to then join this a different way, and we can actually look at per variant, right? If we want to look at assignment times, we can look at, when was the first versus last assignment. We're kind of validating again our percent split, right? So if we're not necessarily looking at the other chart, this is another way to just make sure, okay, we actually have a true 50-50 split here. And then we can look at our secondary metrics. So we can see our treatment, not only do we have measurable lift, right, conversion rate lift, but we also have measurable revenue lift, which is great. So the treatments had brought in so far a little bit more revenue than control. We can see the average time between adding to cart, which is the same as the timestamp of the assignment, and when that sale was made. And we can see kind of here we're also breaking down the median timestamp. This is an interesting example because in this case, we were hoping that our time to sale was actually decreased as part of the treatment. In this case, they're pretty much the same, right? So we're seeing no measurable impact one way or another to Apple Pay, but we would likely still end up calling this treatment a winner eventually because we're seeing a measurable and conversion rate increase, and we're seeing some overall revenue numbers go up, not to mention sales volume increase. So this is just one example of how we might use winning variant to run an experiment inside of Snowflake. The real power here is being able to not only manage the experiment completely inside of Snowflake, using existing Snowflake RBAC, not having to worry about security or compliance considerations, shipping data in and out, but also because all of the experimentation data is landing in your Snowflake account in real time, it's really easy for analysts to build these pipelines to get experimentation data that they actually care about, depending on the nuance of the organization that they're inside of. The next level of this, and one of the things that we help customers with as part of their onboarding experience, is not only formulating these queries as part of the analytical pipeline, but then visualizing them inside of their existing BI tool. So now we would be able to take the results of these queries and put them either in a Snowflake dashboard, in Power BI, in Tableau, whatever organizations are already using for reporting. We can create an experimentation report set, making winning variant look and feel like it's an in-house platform without teams having to actually build or maintain it at all. Thanks for watching this today. If you have any other questions, there's more documentation available at docs.winningvariant.com, or feel free to reach out to us through our website at www.winningvariant.com.